All right, we are at 11:03 this morning. We'll go ahead and kick off the webinar. Thank you very much for joining the first Pixonality webinar with Ryne Sherman from Hogan Assessments. We are looking forward to presenting you a fabulous webinar. Again, my name is Jag Nidger. For those of you who don't know me, I do recognize a lot of the names that are here. We look forward to connecting with you post. If you have any questions or during the webinar that you'd like to have asked, please throw it in the chat, and we're happy to be able to kick it off and answer any of those questions for you. So absolutely my pleasure to introduce Ryne Sherman, Chief Science Officer from Hogan Assessment. I will let Ryan introduce himself. I'm sure there's a great slide and he's got some valuable information to share about him, but we are so excited to have Ryan on today, and a webinar that's just an absolute winner. I was originally on this webinar when it was presented some time ago, thought it was fantastic, and that's why we're bringing it over to the Pixonality family and our clients and customers that come along with it. Ryan, over to you.
All right, thanks, Jag. Thanks for inviting me here today. Happy to present on this topic. I will just pull my slides up here. You mentioned a little background. I did not prepare a background slide, but I can just give a brief background about myself. As you mentioned, I'm the Chief Science Officer at Hogan Assessment Systems. My background is in personality psychology. I have a PhD in personality psychology from the University of California, Riverside. And I was a professor of social psychology, personality psychology, for 6 years before joining Hogan Assessments as the Chief Science Officer. During that time, as I worked as a professor, I also did quite a bit of consulting work, looking at helping organizations identify talent, find better talent, and make a critical strategic leadership decision. So happy to be here with you all today to talk about this topic here, candidate experience. So when it comes to taking assessments, we get lots and lots of questions about candidate experience. In fact, many of our clients come and tell us that the candidate experience is really important. And so, as you'll see in this webinar, the real goal of what I'm going to present here today is to communicate to you what candidates tell us that they really want from their candidate experience or from their experience as a job applicant. So this is the agenda for what we're going to cover today. I'm going to talk about some of the key outcomes that companies care about. I'm going to talk about how there's been this recent explosion of the importance, emphasizing the importance of candidate experience in the application process. I'm going to talk about a survey that we conducted and how that, how many people we had and all the information behind that survey. And then ultimately, I'm going to tell you what that survey tells us about what candidates want. And finally, through a series of extra analyses or sort of some supplemental analyses, we identified some demographic differences that might be of interest to those of you on the webinar in understanding your candidates and what candidates want out of the recruitment or job application process. And then finally, I'll wrap the whole thing up with some of the key points and takeaways. So to begin here, we know that for most recruiting or hiring or application kind of functions, there are four really big outcomes that companies look at. One is the cost. How much does it cost us? And that includes things like ROI, what's the return on investment for the cost I'm putting into it. Efficiency, which is mostly about speed. How fast can we get this done? How fast can we hire people? How fast can we recruit people? How fast can we fill these positions? Third, they look for the quality of the hire. Can we get a really good candidates? And that includes, by the way, a really big topic today, not just in the United States, but also globally, which is about diversity. Can we make sure that we are not only getting quality hires, but we are also being sensitive to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion? Really important topics as well that most of our clients care about. And then finally, this big topic of candidate experience. We want to make sure that candidates have a positive experience in the recruitment and application process. One reason for that is many clients, and I'm sure many of you might think about the people who apply for your jobs as potential customers. And so even if they don't get a job with your company, you may be thinking, well, I would like that person to still purchase our products, to still be a valued customer for us. And so that's why candidate experience is so important. We worry that if a candidate has a really bad experience applying for or being recruited by our company, perhaps we will also lose their business as a customer. And so these are really the big four overarching outcomes. There are, of course, others that companies might care about, but from what we can tell, these are the biggest four things that we hear from companies and our clients. This last one has really seen a lot of emphasis lately. If we look at news headlines, probably right up there with, if not ahead of or slightly behind, the issue of diversity and inclusion in hiring is this issue of candidate experience. And these are just a few of the things that we see out there over the last few years that, in 2019, improving the candidate experience was seen as a top recruiting goal. We're seeing lots of talk of artificial intelligence and whether or not that can create a more positive candidate experience. And again, it's this whole idea that having a positive candidate experience can lead to future customers down the road. And here are some of the claims, more specific claims that we've seen about candidate experience. One is that millennials or even younger people, what one of my collaborators sometimes calls iGen for the iPhone, the I generation, that says that this group of folks will not complete psychometric assessments. They just simply won't do it. They say, this is insulting, I won't do this. We've heard that candidates are turned off by being asked to complete cognitive or personality measures. We've heard that executives are especially turned off, really insulted by being asked to complete cognitive tests. We've heard that traditional psychometric assessments, so like true false kinds of tests, like the test that we offer at Hogan, are a poor candidate experience. We've also heard that these traditional assessments result in high candidate attrition. That is, candidates just say, that's it, I quit, I'm not going to do this. And we've also heard that candidates prefer gamified assessments to sort of these traditional kinds of assessments that feel much more like games. And finally, we've also heard that candidates will not complete assessments that are too long, that are over 5 or 10 minutes to complete. And so we really wanted to test some of these ideas. We said, well, are these things really true? We've heard people say them, but we've never seen any data on these topics. So where does this notion come from? And we sort of suspected, well, maybe some of it's just made up. Maybe, obviously some people have had that experience, so it comes from somewhere. But what do the data actually have to say? What do candidates actually think about their job application or recruiting experience? So to investigate that, we surveyed more than 2,000 current and recent job seekers globally. This included job seekers from 23 different countries. And 99, almost all of the candidates had applied for a job within the past 3 months. So we've got a really large, not necessarily representative, as you'll see, but we do have a large sample of people who have recently applied to jobs from a global group of individuals. So a few demographics about these people who are in our survey. As you'll see, most of them were entry level, mid-level, or manager level, but we do have some people at the director or executive level. Which I think makes sense. I think most people, obviously most jobs are at the entry level, mid-level, or manager level. There's fewer jobs at the director or executive level. So of course, when we're looking at people who've recently applied for or are currently applying for a job, this seems to be pretty representative of those job levels. When we look at age, again, we see that most candidates here, or most people who were in our survey, were between the ages of 18 to 44. So again, this is pretty typical when we're looking at people who are currently seeking a job or currently being recruited. They tend to be in that sort of younger demographic relative to the more senior individuals who've probably been in a job longer and are less likely to be seeking a new job. And then when we look at the ethnic breakdown, we see that the majority were white, with a large proportion of Asian and Pacific Islander in this survey. There's a couple of reasons for that. We particularly emphasized as part of this survey getting data from China, because we found that to be a really interesting place to gain data from. So we have a large proportion of Asian individuals. And you might be surprised, or some people might be surprised, that the Black or African American sample is large. When I've given this talk in the United States, I think people are really surprised by that. They go, "Whoa, that's not representative of the United States." It's not. This is not a representative sample of the United States. Remember, this is a global sample. We have people from more than, from I think 23 different countries included here. So when we look globally at some of those other countries, Germany, France, there's just fewer African American or Black individuals in some of those countries, and so from a demographic standpoint, so that's why the representation it may look a little strange to you if you're familiar with different cities or different parts of the world, but this is still pretty representative of the countries that we actually surveyed. And when we look at the gender breakdown, a little over half of the people who completed the survey were men. Okay, so in thinking about this topic of what candidates want, a couple of things that I think are worth noting here. First, first thing is that 99% of the candidates said that the recruitment or job application experience affects their view of the company. So yes, candidate experience is important because that experience does affect their view of the company, okay? 42% said that it either moderately or extremely affected their view, right? That experience had a very profound effect on their view of the company. Perhaps most importantly, 77% of executives said that experience had a moderate or extreme effect on how they viewed the company. So we know that this experience is in fact important to candidates, that having a good experience is important to them if you want them to have a positive view of your company at the outset. So that's an important place to start with. One of the things that we asked candidates, and we think this is one of the most informative pieces of information, was what do you really want? What is most important to you? And so we had them rank order these things in terms of their importance. What's more important in an assessment experience, right? You're going to be interviewed, you're going to apply for a job, you're going to be assessed. There may be even some job test in real time. What's most important about that entire process for you? Number one, by far the most highest ranked was fairness. It was ranked either number one or number two, 73% of the time, whereas accuracy was also ranked number one or number two, 67% of the time. So think about that. And I think that's a really important place to start our discussion on this topic of what candidates want. Is we see that most candidates prefer fairness and accuracy. They think that fairness and accuracy are really critical to that job application process. That's the most important thing to them. Interestingly, fun and fast were ranked third and fourth, that only 31% ranked at number one or two, and only 29% ranked fast as number one or two. So this is a little bit contrary to the sort of message we've been hearing about candidate experience. It's important for candidates to have fun during the experience. It's important to be fast. Actually, it seems like candidates much prefer to know that the process was fair and that the process was accurate, that the interviews, that the assessments they took were accurate. That's the most important thing to them. So that's important to keep in mind, because I think the message recently has been lost, that we're not talking about fairness. We're not talking about accuracy a lot of times when we're talking about candidate experience. And so we know candidates want that. It might be wise for companies to emphasize the fairness and the accuracy of their candidate experience. A couple of other things that we know impact the hiring process. This again comes from our survey results. When we asked people what has the potential to most positively impact your view of the company, 42% said interviews. And that's going to be a running theme that we see here. People really seem to prefer the interview, not overwhelmingly, but there is a majority, a slight majority, that seems to prefer the interview, to find that the interview is where they have the potential to have the most positive impact. So on the flip side of that, you can really ruin a candidate experience with bad interviews. So if you're going to do interviews with your candidates, and probably you should, make sure that those interviews are really done in a way that seems fair, in a way that seems accurate, because we know that that's most important, and we know that that's what they weigh most heavily. The second thing that they said has the most potential to positively impact their view of the company was their responsiveness to the application. And this is some running theme that we saw. And in fact, there was an article recently talking about being ghosted, right? So there's this idea that companies are trying to recruit individuals or get individuals, and those individuals aren't responding. Those individuals are not responding to those companies that are trying to hire them. And in response, these individuals who are not responding have said, companies have been ghosting us for years. And that's what this 22% responsiveness to the application is all about. People apply for a job, people get recruited for jobs, people complete assessments. They want to hear where they're at. They want to know what's next in the process. They don't want to wait around and hear back a month later, get a Dear John letter that says, sorry, there were lots of great applicants. And this is really important. And a lot of companies really seem to fail in this. People want that responsiveness. They want to know where they're at so they can move on if necessary. So what has the most potential to negatively impact your view? This was, I think, was really enlightening. The number one most negative impact on the company was offers and rejections. So for all of the talk of candidate experience, and again, we know that candidates do think that the experience has a positive or negative effect. The thing that seems to most negatively affect their view of the company is whether or not they get a job offer. And so look, the point here is we can try to make the candidate experience as best as we possibly can. But at the end of the day, if you're not offering somebody a job, if you are rejecting them from a job, they're probably going to have some negative view of your company anyway, right? There's not a whole lot you can do to fix that, other than, again, try to make that interview as engaging as possible. Try to emphasize the fairness and the accuracy of your process. Try to be responsive to those applications. But ultimately, if you reject somebody from the job, they're probably going to have at least a slightly negative view of the company for some period of time. Again, I already mentioned responsiveness to the application, so that's really important. And I mentioned interviews, and then coming in third was assessments. And again, this is where we're hearing lots of people talk about assessments. People don't want to take those. That creates a negative impression of our company. As you can see here, that's actually ranking fourth, right? So it's the number one thing that's going to create a negative view of your company is not offering them a job. There's probably not much you can do about that, but you can be responsive to the applications, and you can conduct interviews that come across as more fair and more accurate. When we look at things like what would discourage you from applying for a job, a minority, but some proportion of individuals indicated the number of assessments to complete and the time to apply and complete assessments. So people do want to apply quickly. They want to get their name in the ring for consideration quickly. And then they want to hear back relatively quickly as well. Thinking about time to take an assessment, we asked people, how long would you spend to take assessments? The average was 42 minutes, although some large proportion of people actually said that there was really no limit. They would take assessments for as long as they wanted. Again, you saw sizable chunks of people around 30 minutes and 60 minutes. So this suggests to us that despite this idea that people won't spend more than 5 or 10 minutes, there's actually very few people who said they would only spend 5 or 10 minutes on assessments. Overwhelmingly, many people said, no, I want the job. I will complete the assessments, and I'm willing to commit the amount of time it takes to do that. So that, even though that is a concern that people bring up a lot, the data seem to show that candidates really aren't that worried about that. They're happy to take the assessments in any amount of time, so long as it gets their name for consideration, and so long as, again, you will be responsive to their assessment results. One of the things that is worth noting, and this is research that was done by, not by Hogan, but by some other folks about candidate attrition. So this is another thing that people worry about. If the assessments are too long, then really good candidates will drop out and will be missing out on these really top quality candidates because the assessments took too long. Turns out that's a complete myth. It turns out that shorter assessments don't really reduce dropout, at least in the kind that you would care about. So most people drop out of an assessment in the first 10 minutes of an assessment. And beyond that, the dropout rate is very, very small, is around 1 to 2%. So once you get to those first 10 minutes, then there's very little dropout. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, that's when those really high quality candidates drop out in the first 10 minutes. And again, this research done by some other folks showed that that's actually not the case, that top quality candidates are far more likely to complete the assessment. So you can do this through the kinds of studies that they did. They just showed how were people doing on the assessment when they dropped out. And it turns out that people who are really not a good fit are doing really poorly on the assessments. This is whether it's cognitive or even personality assessments, are much more likely to drop out early. And so what's really going on here is these individuals are figuring out, wait a minute, this actually isn't the job for me. I'm just going to drop out. So for the concern about dropout, it's really not a concern. The people who drop out are far less likely to be a good fit for the job anyway. And so you much prefer the candidates who actually do finish. And again, as we just showed on the previous slide, there really aren't that many concerns about the length of assessment. Most people will really take 30, 45 minutes or even longer to complete assessments. So this candidate attrition, losing the really top quality candidates because the assessments are too long, is not a serious issue. Even though I know people think about it as it is, it seems like the data suggests that this is not a problem. We also asked the candidates in our survey about their preferences for different types of assessments. We see a slight majority preferring interviews to personality tests. We see a slight majority, again, preferring cognitive to personality tests. We see a slight majority preferring interviews to cognitive tests. And all of these are very slight. And again, we see a slight preference for traditional questionnaires to game-based questionnaires. Again, these are very, very close to 50-50, so I wouldn't really take too much stock in these. I think it's quite interesting that about half of the people prefer one to the other. Some years ago, I was teaching a course on using personality assessments to select candidates for jobs, and I asked my students in the course, I said, which of these would you prefer? Would you prefer a personality assessment or would you prefer an interview? And I've done this in several courses, I guess, but the very first one really stands out to me because in every course, there was always a couple of people who would say, I definitely prefer the interview. And in the very first course, there was one who was just insistent that the interview was the best. That's where he could really best demonstrate his knowledge. Perhaps you will not be surprised to find out that this particular individual was a blonde-haired white male who I think most people would rate as fairly attractive. He was physically fit, had a nice, square jawline. I think most people would say this was a fairly attractive individual and seemed to be quite charismatic in the class. So not really a big surprise that this candidate would prefer an interview over, say, a personality assessment. So the point there is that we have to be a little bit careful about that because the people who might prefer interviews might do so because they know they have a certain qualities that will show up better on an interview and get them, that leg up. Whereas personality assessments don't know those things, don't know how physically attractive you are, for example, and put people on a little bit more of an equal footing. So again, slight preferences for interviews, but about 50-50 on most of these. Here's where I think it gets a little more interesting. When we ask people what best represents your skills, we see interviews get an even bigger advantage. We see 58% saying that they think the interviews best represents their skills. And this is an opportunity for education here because the data are really clear on this, that when interviews are well done and when they're well structured, they can be really informative. But in most cases, interviews are not well structured. Interviews are not well done. And in fact, lead to all kinds of potential for bias, like the kinds that I just mentioned, the tendency to hire people who look similar to the hiring manager, for example. We really should be educating the population a little better about the downsides of interviews, even though people tend to think that is the best representation of their skills. We know, in fact, that is not the case, that personality assessments are a far better representation of somebody's interpersonal tendencies and interpersonal skill set than an interview. Interviews are very circumscribed. People who are charismatic and charming do really well in interviews, but people who lack charisma and charm maybe don't do so well in interviews, even though they would tend to perform much better on the job. So there's a lot of opportunity for education there. We see about 50-50 when it comes to personality and cognitive. And we see, again, a little edge for interviews versus cognitive tests for best skill representation. And we also do see people, and this was one that we were really interested in because there's lots of talk about gamification, that I think while people might enjoy game-based questionnaires, they seem to think that the traditional questionnaires do a better job of representing their skill set. And then finally, we asked about fairness of method. And again, here's a real opportunity for some education. Most people actually thought the interviews were more fair than personality assessments. And of course, this is just patently false. We know this. There's lots and lots of data on this showing that personality assessments that are blind to gender, personality assessments are blind to race, personality assessments are blind to age. They're blind to, as I mentioned earlier, physical attractiveness, and interviews are not, right? All of that stuff is front and center in an interview, and leads to, doesn't necessarily mean there will be bias. It doesn't necessarily mean there will be unfairness, but it leads to the potential for unfairness in an interview. Whereas with a personality assessment, we know that's not the case. We know that that is, in fact, one of the fairest methods of evaluating potential candidates. We see that cognitive and personality were somewhat tied, which is a little bit of a surprise because there's lots and lots of discussion about whether or not cognitive tests are fair. And again, interviews again had a slight advantage over cognitive tests in terms of candidates' perceptions of fairness. And then finally, we asked what's most enjoyable. Candidates did say personality assessments were slightly more enjoyable than interviews. They said that personality assessments were more enjoyable than cognitive tests, which is no surprise. Many people don't think taking a test, a math test, for example, is a lot of fun. Cognitive tests and interviews were seen as about the same, and game-based questionnaires did beat out traditional questionnaires in terms of being the most fun and most enjoyable. This is consistent with some other literature on gamification, showing that gamified assessments are in fact more fun. Playing games is more fun than doing tests, but nonetheless, as we saw on the previous slide, people do tend to think that taking the traditional questionnaires is a little bit more fair and more reflective of their skills. So now I want to get into some of these country differences that we found. And so we had large enough samples, and unfortunately, we did not have a large enough sample. We had people from Canada in our sample, but we did not have a large enough sample to really say, okay, let's divide this up and compare Canada to some of these other countries. So I can't speak to Canadian differences here, which is a little unfortunate, but I can speak to some of these where we did have some larger samples. So a couple of things here. One, we know that interviews drove the most positive view of the company in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But assessments, personality and cognitive assessments, were the most important in China, which again sets China really out as sort of an outlier here. We see that on the next one as well, or sorry, a little later on as well. We also know that, that this process, being responsive, giving offers, have rejections, most negatively drives views in China, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So this is what we talked about earlier. Seems to be pretty consistent there, that offers and rejections are pretty important there. Although in France, it was slightly more important that the interview be a positive experience. China, again, as I mentioned, really stood out as an outlier to us. A couple of things here. They tended to prefer cognitive tests. They tended to prefer personality tests, and they pretended to prefer game-based tests. So those were all different from the other countries. Preferring cognitive tests, preferring personality tests. Most people would say, I don't know, cognitive tests, I don't want to take that. But in China, there was actually a preference for that. And they also preferred the game-based test over the traditional test, which was unusual there. They also felt that cognitive and personality best represented their skills, which we actually know is more true. So they're correct to have that view. They also found that cognitive and personality to be more fair, which again, we also know that's true. And they far more enjoyed cognitive compared to other countries. So I think that's an interesting cultural thing there. So if we're working with candidates who are from China or Chinese descent, it may be worth noting that those candidates might actually prefer those cognitive assessments to other assessments relative to other candidates. A few age differences. These probably aren't too surprising. They might match your stereotypes for age. People under 35 tend to prefer personality tests over cognitive tests, and not surprisingly, they tended to have a stronger preference for game-based tests. Again, these weren't huge differences, but there was a small difference for younger people that prefer the game-based tests. Candidates who are 35 and over tended to prefer the cognitive tests, and they also tended to prefer the traditional questionnaires, thinking that those traditional questionnaires best reflected their skills and abilities. But all age groups tended to find personality more enjoyable than cognitive, again, with the exception being those candidates from China. And then when we look at job level differences, we found that individual contributors, people at that level, tended to prefer personality over cognitive. And contrary to what we had heard going into this study, directors and executives actually preferred cognitive tests over personality tests. So again, we were told, people at that level, a cognitive test would be insulting. In fact, they actually preferred it over a personality test. And that's also true that executives preferred cognitive and personality tests over interviews. Again, a lot of people think, well, interviews, that's what executives want. They don't want to. No, they actually preferred those assessments, which I think was a surprise to many people. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here with some key takeaways, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A if anybody has any questions. Almost every candidate said that the hiring process affects their view of the company. So we know that that process is important. We know it's important to have a positive candidate experience. What does a positive candidate experience mean? A couple of things that we found out. One is that candidates overwhelmingly prefer accuracy and fairness over fun and speed. So if you want to have a positive candidate experience, you want to make sure that you are emphasizing the accuracy of what you're doing. You're emphasizing the fairness of your process. And of course, we also know that they tended to enjoy it when, of course, they got the job, which we can't do for everybody, but when they were responded to, right? So respecting your candidates, respecting their time by emphasizing accuracy, fairness, and being responsive to their application is really important. We also learned that interviews were preferred overall. But that's probably not a great thing, that we've got some educating to do because we know that personality assessments are a much more fair way and a much better representation of a candidate's skills. With the exception being executives did tend to prefer cognitive and personality. So perhaps executives have been around long enough that they've learned about these things that we don't have as much educating to do at that level, but definitely at the lower levels, we see that people still tend to prefer those interviews. As I mentioned, we already know that cognitive and personality tests are more accurate than interviews, that personality is unbiased on age and ethnicity and race and gender. So this is, I think, a really big takeaway for many of us, that we need to be really clear with our candidates about the value of personality assessments, the value of cognitive assessments in terms of fairness and accuracy. And finally, it's important to consider the country perspective. We found that China really stood out as quite different from other countries in our sample. And when we're thinking about candidate experience, the country that you're working in might be of utmost importance to consider. That's all for me. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate your time.
Wonderful, Ryne. Thank you very much. You really provoked a lot of questions, and it's funny. I've got the same question over and over from a lot of individuals, and the question is kind of regards to sharing reports with candidates when they're unsuccessful. And the question now kind of goes kind of twofold is, do you do a debrief with the candidate and walk them through, the results? Or, do you just send them a candidate profile to make them aware?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. A couple of things that we know about it is we did ask candidates about responsiveness and what kind of feedback they wanted. And it was a really interesting thing. We found that candidates said that they wanted feedback, but in digging a little deeper, what we learned was what they really want is feedback about whether they got the job or not. It wasn't so much about that. Nonetheless, we do think it is, in our view, it is an ethical responsibility if you assess someone to give them some kind of feedback, to tell them what that means. I know many of the clients we work with worry about the legal issues that might be involved with that. For example, if a hiring manager decides for whatever reason that they did not want to hire a candidate and they get a report that says, hey, you're a pretty good fit for that job, they're worried that might result in a lawsuit because, of course, the hiring manager might have had other reasons that were job relevant, maybe based on an interview response or something like that, for not going forward with that candidate. But getting a report that says, hey, you were a pretty good fit for that job might seem like there's a conflict there. So I get that concern. There are report options available where you wouldn't have to do that, where you could say, hey, this is, here's some feedback for you. And in our experience and working with some of the clients who do this, that actually does result in a more positive candidate experience. So a candidate comes in, they take an assessment, they don't get the job, but they do get some feedback about their personality and their strengths and what kinds of jobs might be a good fit for them in the future. Candidates do seem to appreciate that. And I think it does create a more positive view of that company, even if they didn't get that job. So, the report that a candidate gets back doesn't have to be the same report that a hiring manager might get. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that we can give candidates feedback in a way that is informative and accurate for them and helpful for them, but doesn't necessarily conflict with whatever result they might get in terms of continuing with their application process.
Ryan, this next question, I think this is just really targeted because you're the chief science officer. The follow-up question to that was, what reports would you want to share with an executive level? Obviously we don't want to present them with the entire leadership forecast series, but what is the report that you would share at that senior level?
Yeah, so a couple of report options that I think we have available that I think would make a lot of sense at that level. The summary report is pretty good, particularly the one without scores, because it's really just narrative. There are some reports that I wouldn't necessarily say are the best for that level. I mean, you could do an insight report, but typically an insight report, we would want like a kind of feedback and that sort of thing to go with it. But probably I think I would recommend the summary report at the executive level. If we were going down lower in the organization, things like the career report, things like the compass report are actually quite good. Again, it's mostly narrative. There's a little bit of some graphical stuff in there, like HPI scores or things like that, but it's not real deep in terms of the what does this score mean? What does that score mean? It just gives you a really narrative summary of kinds of jobs that you'd be best fit for, the kinds of careers that you might enjoy. So I think those would be really good at that sort of lower tier. And in fact, I would even encourage companies to do that for people that they hire. If you hire this candidate, also give them a career and compass report, because that's a really good way to get them sort of launched into the process of really understanding themselves and strategic self-awareness and getting better and becoming better employees right away. But at the executive level, I think I would probably stick with that summary report.
Wonderful. One of the other questions is actually not in recruitment and the assessments, but they're asking about the development side. What type of information are you seeing from, multiple different levels within an organization, whether they're trying to identify high potentials or develop their leaders? How much testing are they willing to complete? And do they have preferences on what those assessments look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's actually really an interesting question, because we get told sometimes, well, people don't want to take tests. People don't want to take personality tests. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that's not true. Every day, if you're on social media, you will see an opportunity to take a personality test. You can click a few buttons here or click or put in your name or what. There's all kinds of silly, right, really non-scientific tests out there, and people love to take them. They take them all the time, and what they really love, they don't really love that experience of taking the test, but what they love is that feedback. And so I have no doubt that people are perfectly willing to take these assessments so long as they know they're getting high quality feedback. So if you're taking an assessment and you say, well, this is for your development, and then I never hear back from you, I never get that feedback from you, that's going to be really frustrating as a candidate. But if a candidate gets a really good session, right, if they get a good coach or consultant to deliver feedback on something like the LFS, I can guarantee you that they will have in 99% of the cases, they will have a positive experience. They will say it was really rewarding. They will say that they learned a lot about themselves and that they learned about things that they can do better to improve. To me, that the concern about, well, will these people take assessments? Oh, do I want to ask the executives for 45 minutes of their time? I think it's pretty clear that people will take an assessment so long as they know they get that value at the end.
Wonderful. Ryan, that wraps up this session. Thank you very much for attending. I thought the information that you shared is fantastic. We will be sharing the deck with the participants of the webinar, as well as this will be added to our website to be able to view moving forward. Thank you very much, Ryan. We appreciate it. And for everybody else that was that joined us, thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to continue to work with you with Hogan. Thank you.